Hey y'all, welcome to the Clock Tower. I'm Colton here with Brandon. It's a clock talk now. We've got things to talk about because we do. We didn't do a show on Tuesday specifically so that we could do the show during the stream. BCS is almost done. There's one event left. It will be the California event, which is, I believe, Sunday, 2 days from now. And everything else is done, though. So we have enough data where we can actually talk about the fall 2023 meta in a way that I think is meaningful. So we're going to do that. We're going to jump in right away and talk about these things. We're going to have a graphic up on the screen, which is going to have all of your lovely stats, courtesy of Avis from Weiss Tea Time and Alexander. Alexander is the one who goes around and collects all the data at regionals and tries to get people to submit that data. So thank you to Avis and Alexander so much. This would not happen without them. Mm-hmm. They're the ones who make this kind of thing possible. We are just able to take what they do and kind of use it. So we appreciate what they do. They're the ones who really, really make this happen. So these are a lot of numbers. Let's start at the top, I suppose. So this is from all 18 English Weiss regionals that have been completed so far, which is through December 3rd. There are a lot of numbers on this chart, so we're going to talk about what those are real quick. Top 8 is everything, or T8 is everything in top 8. T4, everything that made top 4. That and the top 8 number does include that, so like those aren't exclusive. And then W's are for wins. I feel like that's pretty straightforward. Rep percentage is representation. That data is based off of what Alexander was able to collect. It's not perfect data because not every deck has been reported in Alexander's data. So obviously it's not perfect representation rate, but we got enough, about I think a little over 40% of all the decks that were played in Springfest or in the BCS so far this year have been reported. So we have a pretty good cross section, a pretty good idea of what sets people are playing at what rate. Top percentage is what percentage of tops were a certain set. So for example, for Hololive, 24.3% of the decks reported were Hololive. 20.1% of all of the tops, all the decks that made top 8 across all the events, were also Hololive. Finally, R ratio T, the R to T ratio there, that's representation rate to top percentage as a ratio. It basically gives an idea of like how well a deck performed in conjuncture with how well represented it was. So like raw tops doesn't necessarily tell you like Hololive got 29 tops and Slime got 27 tops, but Slime wasn't played as much as Hololive, so Slime had a higher conversion rate from representation into top 8, and that's useful and meaningful data. So we've got that up on the screen as well. So let's get started. And we have our first donation. Brian donated $3. Thank you, Brian, for getting us started on this third annual Christmas charity live stream. Again, once we get to 100, we will unlock our first donation goal, which is chat decks, which means that folks will be able to submit deck lists, and Brandon and I will have to pick one and play them. It's terrifying. We did this last year, and some of you are terrible people. And submitted some terrible things for us to have to play. So let's get started on this actual data analysis, and we'll start with Hololive. Hololive coming into the season, I think everyone knew was going to be a great deck. We expected that.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, we expected a lot from Hololive actually coming into this season, especially with a lot of the things coming through and like the explosive finishes we have seen with some of those decks.
Yeah, and it's not surprising to see that it led the way in tops. What is a little bit surprising, I think, is how it wasn't as efficient in terms of top percentage to representation rate. Like its rep to top ratio is less than 1, which is if you're familiar with baseball and like wins above replacement, 1 is kind of like the target number here because it means that you achieved top 8 as often as you would expect to achieve top 8 given your representation. And Hololive didn't do that. Now, I think a lot of that has to do with Hololive is a very, very popular set. So while a lot of good players were playing Hololive, a lot of new players also picked up Hololive. a lot of players that maybe don't have as much experience in BCS environments. And there's a donation from Pittsburgh Weiss Schwarz. Thank you guys so much. $50 from Pittsburgh Weiss Schwarz to get us over the halfway mark to our first stretch goal. Thank you guys so much. We're going to have Carmen on in a little bit, so looking forward to that as well. So Hololive, played by a lot of people. I think that explains a lot of why it maybe didn't have the conversion rate that you might see in some of these other sets. The big story is Gura, right? Like, I think a lot of people were very concerned about Gura being too good. A lot of people wanted Gura to be banned on the restriction list that came out a couple of weeks ago, and it wasn't hit. I think part of the reason it wasn't hit was because of what we're seeing here, frankly. Gura, 12 total tops, 6 top 4s, and only 1 event win across all of BCS. What do you think is Gura's spot in the meta right now, Brandon? And we're going to talk about it in like a tier list conversation tomorrow. That's going to be tomorrow at noon. Be sure to join us for that. Or if you're watching on the archive on the VOD, we will be posting that at some point over the next couple of weeks. We'll get into details about that in a little bit. But point is, we're talking about the tier list. We're talking about this in more of a tier list context tomorrow afternoon. But for now, Gura wasn't dominant, but was good. Brandon, what's your take on Gura? What's Gura's position right now? How do you feel about Gura?
Well, I think the big thing was there was also a little bit of a lack of consistency with Gura, right? Being able to, there were ways to play into it, kind of rush it early so it wasn't able to get the setup that it needed or wanted. There were definitely a lot of ways to be able to play into it, and it definitely had some things that it was facing off against really early. So it was kind of it faced some difficulties going in. So not seeing as much Gura up here, I think, is actually relatively reasonable. I think it makes sense. Gura being explosive and being able to finish out people from potentially 2-0 is amazing, but the consistency of pulling it off from 2-0 and needing to do that every time is not always going to happen.
Yeah, and thank you, Weiss and Chill, $20 towards our first stretch goal. We're up to $73 total, very close to that $100 goal for chat decks. Again, all the money we're raising today goes to the Project for Awesome, and if we hit that $500 total, we'll see that doubled. We'll get to join the matching fund for the Project for Awesome this year. So thank you so much, Liam, for the donation. Yeah, I think that, so the thing with Gura, as someone who played Gura, I didn't play the Oski package. I played the Cali level 1 because I liked that better. I thought it was a little more consistent. It could just eat and die, especially if it triggered a lot, because it doesn't have mill. Like, the standby package doesn't have a lot of mill. So it was not super hard to push Gura into level 2 in deck 1. And then it's decompressed, and then you just keep throwing damage at Gura, especially if it's triggering. If Gura triggers twice, it's gonna eat 7. Like, it's gonna eat damage the next turn, especially with these other decks in the format that can throw damage at the board because they're throwing extra climaxes at the board, right? Like Slime, before ban, threw down climaxes at 1, 2, and 3. So it was throwing down an extra climax pretty much every game. Because it as a part of its game plan, right? Like, in addition to just normally wanting to throw down climaxes, push damage, as a part of its natural game plan, because it's trying to combo 3 times, it's throwing down the extra CX at 2. And I think that really hurts Gura, because it's so easy for Gura to be out of compression, because it doesn't have the mill to fix itself. And that's actually why I was playing the Cali list. Was because it has that extra mill. It doesn't bring out the level 2 and the level 3 early to save those resources. It's much harder to try to triple. The ceiling is a little bit lower, but the floor, I think, is higher because you're not as likely to eat all that extra damage because of the decompression and the lack of deck speed. But but to your point specifically, you're talking about, yeah, Gura's top end is extremely powerful. But also, Gura tended to play a little from behind. It would go to level 3, Gura would, before the opponent, more often than not, in my experience, especially the standby list. And then it would want to close from 2-4, 2-5, sometimes 2-3 or earlier every game. It closes from 2-5 and beyond better than any other deck in the meta right now. Not even close. But it had to every game, as you were talking about. It had to do that pretty much every game. And that's hard, right? That's hard to
do consistently. Yeah.
Yeah, that's hard to get every single game. So, and healing down to 3-0, which is what it would do because it has the Gura, right? Because the Gura heals. Healing down to 3-0, especially if you're struggling with compression, especially in the modern meta, just isn't enough. So, like, Gura almost had to deal 9 or 10 damage almost every time. And, you know, obviously, there are obviously exceptions, right? Not every game went that way. But enough games went that way where Gura, the pressure was on Gura to double and deal 9 or 10 with 2 on board, and it just wasn't consistent enough to always get there, despite the high ceiling. And I would even say it has a high floor, right? Like I don't think anything closes from 3-0 better than Gura. But the challenge wasn't closing from 3-0; it was closing from 2-4 or 2-3.
Well, and going into with the other big deck being Slime, having that kind of compression to be able to even survive that, I think is actually fantastic too. So like it's been like it had some pretty good counters right away. But I think that's also why we saw these many different variants of Hololive as well, right? We saw the 8 standby list come and rise in as well, trying to help make that happen. Right? With the Ozzy Polka kind of combination there.
Yeah, we saw a lot more of this, and honestly, I'm a big fan of this. I really, really like this. I wasn't sure about it when I first saw the list, but I really like what the standby heavy packages were doing. I like what it's doing with the Luna. It's kind of like that damage reduction kind of package. I think it's fun. Like I think there's a lot of good stuff there. I think it's the best 8 standby list in the meta right now is this Hololive 8 standby list. And I mean, yeah, I just think it's good. It does the things that an 8 standby list does, but it also has a really nice productive combo in the Ozki, which we didn't even talk about in the context of Gura. Like the Ozki combo is solid because it's essentially a +2 on a standby because you get to search and bounce the combo itself back into hand, and the combo gives 1,000 power, and you get to keep slamming it down over and over again. That's really nice. And then in addition, you get your Polka, which is, it's a 1/1 standby target, so you can get it down for free with with these 8 triggers. And on attack on a standby combo, you get to salvage pretty much anything as long as you have the memory condition. And even if you're only salvaging level 2s, that's probably fine early on, because a lot of those level 3s are standby targets anyway. So, like, a lot of these lists are trying to get the Lunas down. You have the Miko, the Sakura Miko in the back row, the Brainstormer in the back row that gives a bunch of power and also heals when you play it from hand. The Amagi that jumps back into your hand on CX play. Just a lot of really, really nice pieces. And I don't know if the 8 standby list is solved yet, but it wouldn't surprise me if, as we go through the winter and head into Springfest, if Ozki Polka actually overtakes Ozki Gura, both in terms of representation and meta relevance. Because it felt like the Ozki Polka, the 8 standby list, was really starting to pop off. It really felt like it was starting to get better. And the other list that really started to take off is an old favorite, Kanata Marine.
Yeah,
and that's why that's up here on this list as well, is because that deck, before the Slime Man in particular, it wasn't winning board as much at 2 with its Kanata early plays. But now that Slime has kind of moved out, Kanata Marine is back, baby.
Well, it's not necessarily Slime even. It's the Alice Spam, I think, was a big thing to that. Like, the Alice being able to come in at 1 and establish board dominance that early. Yeah. I think it also set up some things as well with that. And with Alice effectively removed, we saw definitely a big insurgence of Kanata Marine after that fact. In part because, realistically, Kanata Marine was then all of a sudden the biggest board.
Yeah, and I'm talking about Alice, not Slime. Like, obviously, Slime still comes down to level 2. It still does, the big board thing that Slime does. You're right, it was Alice. The ban on Alice is what made Kanata Marine really come back. Because Marine's still good. It still closes from 3-0, and Kanata allows you to potentially compress. So like even if you do go to 3, if you heal down to 3-0, like you could live in theory. You could theoretically get 2 turns at 3 with this list because it has better compression than most. It's still a little bit like Marian still doesn't have the ceiling that the Gura does. I think the Gura's still in the better position right now.
Well, yeah, no, 100%. Gura has a huge ceiling. However, Marine is also, I think, very consistent and able to kind of try to get that happen.
Exactly, and that's the give and take, right?
Yeah.
Like, do you want a deck that's going to have a more consistent shot to close from, say, 2-5, 2-6, or do you want the deck that's going to have the higher ceiling and could close from 2-2, 2-1, but also might whiff at 2-5, 2-6?
Well, Counter Marine also has the ability to play more defensively too, which I think is a huge thing here.
Yeah, and it really allows you to lean into the tap counter as well. You're allowed to. It's much easier to play the Hachima Beam because of the way the resource management works in Kanata Marine. Because you have all these resources built off of this Kanata combo, it's much easier to play the tap counter.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. So, like, we're seeing that resurgence come through, seeing the 8 standby build, as well as kind of the traditional ASCII Gura that we've been expecting to see. We've seen a lot of Hololive, and we've seen also, these are just the big 3 of ones that we saw multiple representations of. Like, there were also a bunch of different versions of Hololive that managed to make tops this time around.
Yeah, if we put every single version of Hololive that got a top, half of this chart would be Hololive. And we would also run out of time because we have to talk about things that aren't Hololive to a certain extent. But yeah, Hololive its strength is in its diversity as a set, I think, more than anything else. And that also might be why it's avoiding the Banhammer right now. Aside from the slightly more cynical reason of it's Bushiroad's favorite set because it sells super well. Aside from that, which may or may not be valid, it is a very diverse set, and like only 12 of the 29 tops were Gura.
Well, and I think that's what
there was one Kali Gura that topped as well. So like less than half of the tops were Gura.
And I think that's part of it too, is that it's that representation to top ratio. Like there's been a lot of Hololive, and so it makes sense if there a lot of Hololive was topping because a lot of it's being played. But just because we're not seeing it as much in top 8, I think is also a big key of why it hasn't, or why it hasn't. Because like they went through and explained why it hadn't touched those sets yet too. So they were keeping an eye on things and keeping an eye on specifically Hololive. So
yeah,
could we see a ban in the future? Probably. I wouldn't be surprised at some point. But
it wouldn't surprise me either. I think the most likely ban, if I'm being honest, the most likely restriction is probably Gura to 2. I think that's the most likely restriction. If they wanted to hit Gura, I could see them in theory hitting the ASCII. I hope they don't, because the ASCII is such a enabler for all of these really fun standby decks. But I could see, like, if ASCII is part of the engine for the majority of Hololive lists, which right now, 17 of these lists were either ASCII Gura or ASCII Polka. So if they see that as a problem in the future, then maybe they could limit the ASCII or restrict it with, say, the Gura or the Polka. So hopefully, I hope they don't do that, because I think the ASCII, is a really interesting card, and I think that it allows you to enter a really interesting deck building space as a player. But we'll see what they do in the future.
Mm-hmm. With that in mind, Slime also had quite a few tops then.
Yeah, Slime was the most efficient. I would say out of the decks that were well represented, it was the most efficient in its rep to top ratio. Only 12% of players on Slime, almost 19% of tops were Slime. So Slime got played about half as much as Hololive and had almost as many tops. That's a very, very impressive ratio. I see Braden in the chat. What's up, Braden? Good to see you. We'll have Braden on later on tonight. I think 10 o'clock is when Braden is checking in from California this week. So it'll be good to have him on for some gameplay later on. Shizu into the level 2, the 8 pants list.
Rip Shizu.
Yeah, exactly. We'll get into that. Great list. Obviously great list. I wasn't super sold on it when I first saw it. I'm like, it's 3 combos. No. Okay. She's selecting into the Mirren to drop the Mirren, which was huge and 1 board and allowed you to play the Benimaru, which did not have a ton of reach necessarily, but was a a good combo list top end. Like solid list. Solid list. It did not have the ceiling at level 3 that say Gura did. Right? It still doesn't. Like that's just it doesn't do as much damage as Gura, that's fine. But it's so much more compressed in the mid game because it gets to play the memory game a lot more. It gets to move through the deck a lot faster. Like it is in a lot of ways, it's just a pretty normal 1k1 without a normal level 3 top end. But it also wins board at 2 in the same way that a standby deck does. You're a slime player, Brandon. You talk about Shizu Mirin for a second. Like from a player perspective, this is just coming from someone who sat across from it.
Sure. No, like the big part being able to Shizu was a big part. Was also helped mill, helped compress a little bit with going to memory, right? So it's like it's doing a couple different things at once. But the big idea is that it also has the pants trigger, so you can also try to loop those climaxes a little bit more efficiently, so you can get the level 2 combo going. The idea was that Shizu helped set up the pieces to get Mirin into place. And the Mirin kind of paired in with that too, because it's a level 2 combo, so your cigarettes combo on Shizu is a little bit better on average because of that too. So you can usually get the pieces you need to get Mirins into play. Mirin having a bonder that you could get, it's also a level 1 on the same color as Shizu is also a big deal too.
Mm-hmm.
So just being able to get all those things into play is made the list very efficient to play and to do fairly well, and realistically relatively easy to do too. Like you wouldn't have to focus on the combo at 1 as much because the Mirin is actually as powerful as it is.
Yeah.
But you can play into it and it allows you to play in it kind of around with some of those different features too.
Yeah.
With
and the
that
fact
as
that
mind though,
you're talking about your level 1 bonder is a good card in and of itself.
Yeah. With that,
so it allowed you to even if you didn't get 3 lanes of Shizu, you had the bonder in your off lane, and that's also a pretty solid piece. But you continue.
With that in mind, that's kind of why even when Shizu is removed from that deck, because realistically, with the ban, you have to choose between Shizu or Mirin. If you're choosing the Mirin, you're kind of playing around with that. We saw actually a couple of these kind of lists prior to the ban, but after the ban, we've seen a lot more of this. That the standby level 1 combo Rimuru into then the Mirin at level 2. So it's kind of that stock charge standby combo, standbying in that back row hexproof, which is one of the big pieces that actually makes this deck work really well, is being able to apply global hexproof to the board. And being able to stand by that piece in as early as level 1. Turning that standby combo of costless 5/5s into costless 7/5s on attack. That can stock charge. That'll allow you to get the stock to be able to pay out the Mirins or play down the Mirins pretty efficiently that way. So you can also you have all these resources now to be able to get these cards on the field. So and realistically that can help pay out some of those climaxes you probably triggered during that time.
Yeah, after the ban came down, it really felt like the standby list was the natural pivot because of the way that it generates advantage, and it's also able to generate advantage directly into getting those 2/1s down. So to answer the question that I see in the chat, is there a consensus on what combo to replace Shizu with in Slime? I don't think there's a consensus, but I do think that right now standby is the most popular play. But I've also seen people playing into top ends as opposed to level 1 games. We saw a wind top end make a top. We saw just a two soul rush kind of thing with the Mirin pants get played. So there's still a lot of experimentation that's happening right now with Slime. I think standby pants was like the most natural pivot because like you're talking about, like with it's essentially a stock charge combo, right? Because you get to twin drive for free, and because you're hitting standby triggers, you're able to potentially not only get the 2/1 with hexproof on the board for free off of what you played, you can also potentially trigger a Mirin onto the board or some of your other pieces that you need.
Yep.
So I think that's the most natural pivot, but I think the Slime players are still working it out. And tomorrow we're gonna have Clinton Chan on with us to talk with us about it. Or we're building the tier list tomorrow.
Yep.
So I'm sure that he will have some thoughts on what needs to come with slime. As is it fair to say the world's best slime player? I think it's fair to say he's probably the world's best slime player right now, or at least one of them for sure.
At least the most productive.
Yeah. So definitely looking forward to that conversation with him because I'm sure he will have some thoughts on that. Moving on to Sword Art. Rip Alice.
Yeah, so Alice was really good. Alice was really strong. Alice is really gone. So as much as we can talk about a lot of the stuff that Alice did do and have the big wall and the big resource generation starting as early as 1, realistically, with the limit to with limit 2, we're not seeing that same kind of consistency to be able to bring that on at 1. And at that point, is it worth it to play at level 2 if you only have access to 2 copies in your entire deck by that point in the game?
Yeah.
That's the question mark, right? So right now, as much as we have seen a lot of Alice and a lot of Alice do really well, effectively, Alice has kind of dropped off the map and returns to what it used to do. We've seen a lot of pivot to the Mother's Rosario combo at 1, specifically like the new Mother's Rosario combo at 1, which can then pair with level 3 combo as well. So there's been a lot of that, and then whatever additional tech is going to be alongside that, I think is still in that process of being fully decided. That's like as a kind of brought together. But I've seen also a lot of lists that require like a lot of the old stuff, right? A lot of the Avatar net decks. Like there's been a lot of that too. So there's been a lot of like experimentation with SAO here. So I wouldn't actually be surprised to see it kind of begin to kind of mimic Hololive in a way where it has a lot of different kinds of decks topping in the long run. But I think at the moment we're going to see very much a decrease in SAO representation.
And this is where I think, based on the way that the 2-1 Alice got treated in JP and now in English, Bushiroad recognizes that Alice was a mistake. I think that they see Alice as a mistake in design. It was too easy to get a massive level 2 onto the board at 1 for a relatively low cost, and that could hold board cross turn and also had a powerful combo. It was too much. I think is Bushiroad's is where Bushiroad fell on that. Ultimately, they decided that it was too easy to get that out, and you got too much advantage for getting it out, both in terms of a powerful combo that plus U2 plus the onboard plus of the 2-1. It was just too much, and there weren't enough pieces around to deal with it effectively in most sets. Some sets had the pieces to deal with this. Like there are some excellent level 2 killers that got a lot of run during kind of the height of the Alice boom and did very well for themselves. But if you didn't have a good tool to deal with Alice directly on the board, you were not going to have a great time. Often if early play bombs wouldn't even do it because they would go to 2 so quickly after refresh. So like, you would swing with some kind of early play bomb or something, and they would eat the 1 or the 2, go to 2, and it's like, well, the early play bomb doesn't work anymore. So it was really hard to deal with the Alice on the board unless your set had something to deal with it. And I do think that to some extent there were a lot of decks that just kind of refused to sleeve up answers to Alice. Didn't want to deviate from what they were doing to try to deal with Alice effectively. But at the same time, it was not an easy thing to deal with. So I recognize, I think Bushiroad recognizes Alice as being too powerful. And it wouldn't surprise me if they veered away from that design space in the future. We almost see that with Slime. Murin is fair Alice in a lot of ways, I think. It's kind of similar to Alice, except it doesn't come down at 1. It's still very good. It wins board, it has a good combo and all that stuff, but it's also not, it's not coming down at 1 to bully it. Or to bully other level 1 boards. And I think that that's a sign that maybe Bushiroad might be pulling back a little bit, because for a while there, we were watching them kind of push all these super powerful cards out for a while. Like, I mean, it felt like Sword Art, Quint, Slime, Hololive, all these extremely powerful decks all just kind of hit the meta, boom, 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 boom. And then for the last 6 months, they haven't really done that. I feel like they're pulling back a little bit.
Well, I think we've also just watching the incoming, like, power creep, right? Because the power creep essentially happened all at the same time, right? Where they all kind of power creeped at the same time, and now we're seeing a bunch of decks that are coming in that are kind of like right either at that same level or maybe just a little under that power creep level. So it's kind of been a almost like a slight like stagnation a little bit of like regards to power creep, which is good, I think,
Yeah,
in the long run.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
but
It was getting out of hand. And I think there were a lot, and I know we complained about it. Like it felt like just powerful sets and powerful sets were dropping, and the meta was being pushed to a very very new place. It feels like they're trying to scale it back a little bit now. With like the latest releases have not been as powerful as the previous ones. They hit Alice very specifically. They didn't really hit much of anything else. Like they hit Slime, but they didn't nuke Slime. Um, and I think that's a sign that they're trying to move away from that kind of commanding the board at one with these massive bodies. I think they're trying to move away from that design space, which is ultimately good for the game long term. We haven't even talked about the different top ends in Sword Art. Argo, basically nowhere to be found. It was either Silica or Kirito,
yeah,
with a little splash of Mother's Rosario as well. But now that Alice is gone, effectively, like you were talking about, Mother's Rosario package going to be a lot more interesting. I wouldn't be surprised to see, like you were making reference to the Avatar Net stuff. Last Shot could come back to a certain extent. I don't know if it's going to be good, but I think that we'll see
well,
more people trying to experiment with things like Last Shot. Wouldn't be surprised to even see like the Zek and Yuki combo, like the standby Silica combo. That's actually like a pretty solid. It's a pretty solid standby combo at 0. So we'll see what happens. Like we'll see what ends up happening with Sword Art. A lot of experimentation to go. We'll see if there's maybe something else that's in these newer sets that might start to emerge. It wouldn't surprise me to see Sword Art players kind of go back to the old standbys, no pun intended. But we'll see. We'll see. Right now, I think you're right. I think it's Mother's Rosario is probably the best package, but Sword Art did not top post Alice ban. So Sword Art players definitely back. They're back in the shop right now, trying to put something together. Moving on to quintuplets. At the start of the season, I thought Quince was going to be at top of this list. I thought Quince was going to be at the top of this list, and I was expecting 8 Salvage to be that list. I still think it's extremely good. The consistency of 8 Salvage is literally off the charts. It's the most consistent deck in the meta right now, I think. Just gets whatever it wants, has 9 cards in hand. The combo is good. It wins board on defense. It has a solid top end. Like it does pretty much whatever it wants for the fate cost of having cards with certain names on the board. So it just gains all this extra advantage and all this extra text just for being the 8 salvage list. 8 standby was kind of the old favorite in Quint's pre-new set. Still solid. We're seeing more people play 3 combos in 8 standby, level 1 and level 2 and level 3 combos in 8 standby. And then we have the 8 choice list, which takes a handful of different approaches to its set of combos. What's your take on where Quince is, Brandon, here as we wrap up the fall season?
I think the big key with Quince is consistency, right? Like the 8 salvage being consistent, the each being relatively consistent, being able to play into certain matchups pretty efficiently. The 8 standby Quince still being able to get its pieces in play where it needs to, right? Like this is kind of still outside of the Hololive. This is like the other big 8 standby build of really the meta, right? So having those kinds of tools and access, I think, is really important. And I think having those different builds within the same set, I think, is actually really interesting. That the set itself has quite a few decks that can see that kind of competitive play. So it's just kind of like a lot of tools to be able to watch out for.
Mm-hmm. And now that we are going to see, obviously less Alice, I think that really does open things up for 8 salvage. Like 8 choice and 8 standby, we're both better into an Alice world. Now that Alice is gone, I think the big thing that was really holding 8 Salvage back, if anything, is now out of the way. So I think we're looking at a world where 8 Salvage, if people play it, I don't think it really has a lot of bad matchups. 8 Salvage specifically. It's super consistent. It wins board on defense against everything that isn't huge. And it gets basically whatever cards it wants whenever it wants it. It gets to hold 9 cards in hand all game. Like that consistency, you can't get that with any other set. So I think especially now that there's no Alice to contend with, I think 8 Salvage is primed for a resurgence here. I think it's going to have a really good winter, and it wouldn't surprise me if we saw 8 Salvage do really, really well at Springfest and in Rumble in the spring. And we'll talk more about that tomorrow when we do the tier list. But like 8 Salvage, man, I was scared of 8 Salvage going into the season, and now with Alice kind of out of the way, I think 8 Salvage is more scary.
It'll definitely be interesting to see for sure. Another deck that kind of popped up this year, or this season rather, was Avatar, right?
Yep. It was interesting to see how people were going to approach Avatar, right? Because obviously a lot of talk about the Sokka and, getting extra attacks with the Sokka. Ultimately, that engine does show up in the Azula package, so you see it there. The Toph combo proved to be really popular. Kind of that go between, kind of in between, Kanata Marine kind of a thing. So, on bar, good combo with a standby package. It was with a standby package with Azula. It allowed you to get those pieces down, and have enough of a mid game before the combo came down. It was interesting to see how people were going to approach it. Like before the season started, there were a lot of different ways that people were talking about potentially building this. There's 8 standby. Some people were really trying to get the Aang top end with all the colors to work. But this is the one that ended up being the most consistent, and I think it makes sense given like the consistency really is the name of the game with these pieces. But also because you have the Sokka, that really lets the Azula combo have a little bit higher of a ceiling than it normally would.
Yeah, but I think with the top level 1 combo, kind of playing that cigarettes also allows you to get to some of those interesting zeros that allow for some kind of non-traditional plussing too. So it really had some of that mid game maintain as well, kind of playing into just trying to get all the pieces for your end game ready to go.
Mm-hmm.
Like it definitely had some really interesting pieces to bring to the table as opposed to some of the other decks too. But it was kind of playing the game in a slightly different way.
Yep. And I mean, level 1 on bar, like, it's good. Level 1 on bar is good. Has been for years. And it continues to be good. Just being able to even just cycle that combo, in addition to having, standby target, having the ability to just hit a standby and just get that big bonus plus, which is one of the reasons why the standby trigger was popular in Gura, why it was popular in Quince, why people in Slime are pivoting to it, is just because the standby trigger is still extremely powerful. So like if you can just play, if you play a standby trigger, it allows you to open up your deck a little bit more. Just because when you hit that trigger, you're going to plus more than if you were playing some other trigger. So it allows you to play a little more freely and a little more loose. And I think with a set like Avatar, which is really diverse, but doesn't necessarily have like that suite of extremely powerful profiles that build like an engine in kind of a traditional sense. This allows you to, as a deck builder, experiment more and find things that work, just because you have the advantage of getting to run that standby trigger. 7 Deadly Sins. All of its top 4 placements were Escanor. Escanor got hit with a restriction almost immediately. That restriction got decreased a little bit with the new restriction list update a few weeks ago, but it doesn't really affect the Escanor list all that much. But I think it's worth noting, like if we look at that, that representation to top ratio, SDS is right up there with Slime and Alice in terms of its ratios in turning representation into tops. Granted, I think that when you get down to these smaller numbers, you're talking more about the diehards, right? The people who've been playing this set more consistently, who believe in this set a little bit more. Whereas with Slime and Sword Art, you've got, a handful of players who are, playing a deck because it's good and because it's known to be good. Maybe those players with less experience, trying to play a good deck in an environment. So I think that just to a certain extent, like this representation, this conversion rate rather, is representative of SDS having a really good player base. The people who play SDS who believe in SDS really believe in it and have been playing it enough to be really good at it. So I think that like there's some of that in the data, right? There's some self-selection bias here in the data. That being said, Escanor is still relevant. For a minute there, it looked like Escanor might be completely dead. Like, it did not do as well in Springfest. It was really starting to fall off. But here in the fall season, back into a singles format, burn one a bunch of times is really good, y'all.
Yeah, being able to still do some of the things that you need to do with it, and having like the biggest hit was consistency, right? With the ban early was the consistency of how easily it was to be able to obtain it. But like realistically, I think the consistency of the early game, I think, is actually still relatively strong. Being able to oftentimes double combo off of that stock soul with the back row. Just kind of trying to loop that combo as much as possible with some of the different tools to get climaxes back into hand, and just kind of building up resources essentially from the back, I think is a huge advantage going forward here.
Yeah, I agree. I think that it's I think it's still reasonably well positioned, and I think that the fact that it doesn't have to battle for board with Alice anymore. I think that matters. I think that's going to give. I think that gives the set. I think it gives the set an opportunity. In a post Alice world to maybe improve on these raw top numbers. I think people are going to go back to it a little bit. I think some people maybe moved off of it because it struggled so much into Alice in the mid game, because it still kind of struggles with its identity in the mid game sometimes. Like, you'll have people who are like really in on the Elizabeth package, and or in on the Stocksoul package, or in on the 2-1. You have people who approach the Escanor mid game differently, but I don't think any of them had a good matchup into Alice specifically. Now that Alice is out of the way, I think it'll free up the SDS players, and maybe get some people to get SDS back out of the box and let it shine a little bit more than it was this season. I mean, it still did well this season. Like, I mean, look at it. It's still the 6th most represented set in top 8 in terms of raw top numbers, and it had a really good conversion rate. Like, SDS had a solid season. I think that I definitely underrated it coming into the season, and I don't think I'm going to do that anymore. So now we come to probably the most, I don't want to say controversial, I don't think it's the right word, the most varied in terms of opinions set in the meta right now. You've got Overlord, and all these lists are Eins. It's all the Eins list. 7 tops, 3 top 4s, 1 event win, and that 1 event win happened in Costa Rica when the deck technically wasn't legal, but the judges let it through. So nothing against that player, for what it's worth. Like, the player was told the deck was legal, player did what they were supposed to do and got the win. Good on them. They earned their spot there. But the set technically wasn't supposed to be played at that event, so I think that's at least worth making mention of. Also, you'll notice the asterisk after representation rate and top rate. That's because the numbers that are in Alexander's data set, I don't believe that they are that they account for Eins coming in later in the meta. So those numbers are adjusted to deal with that, because our handful of tournaments Eins was not legal for. So we've made the adjustment to those numbers to show what Eins' representation and top rate were in the events where it was legal for play. That being said, I think there were a lot of opinions on it, and coming in, I think a lot of people thought it was going to be really strong. I thought it was going to be strong coming in. Brandon, you were way down on it by comparison. And you honestly brought me around over the course of the season because of, we played some games and we did some testing, and I think Overlord struggles with getting rushed. it still needs it needs an extra turn. It needs to have all of its turns to really work. And if you just throw soul at it and stick damage, Overlord's not gonna make it. At least that's the way that I feel. Like having sat across from Overlord enough, like that's the challenge for Overlord, is just like not dying when someone's constantly throwing 3-3-3, 3-4-3 at it turn after turn after turn.
I think Soul Rush is a big thing because realistically, it's dependent on a lot of different things at different times, right? It's a very timing deck, right? Like you need specific timings to do different things. Like ideally, you want to get to your Eins while you have all 5 of the events in waiting room to be able to marker them to be able to then turn around and use them on the following turn with a climax, right? So you kind of need all of those pieces to line up in a row to be able to make it happen, right? You need 2 bar climaxes in a row. With bar, that's not typically a problem, right? Because you're usually getting those back into hand. But you also need to get the advantage and get the pieces parts to make that come down at certain times, so you're not immediately either answered or have to worry about anti-change. So you don't have to like side the board, so you don't have to play around these kind of different tools and places.
Like, yeah, and I think that's one of the challenges is that like it literally has to side, or else it will get anti-changed, because that's the only thing that can touch it. So everyone's holding anti-change, and the Overlord player knows it, and the opponent knows it. They have to side into you even when you're not holding it up, because they don't know. And I think that's a challenge. You know, I think that's a problem, because in a deck that, you know, wants to push all this damage when it gets all of its combo down, to not be able to push all of that damage into a board, I think that's a problem.
Well, and as Patrick pointed out, like there's different decks that can also compete with it too, at like getting to level 2 first kind of thing. Like Contra Marine can also play that racing game to get there to 2 first. So it's like it has some decks in play already that it can also already have to compete with in that kind of same kind of strategy.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's, and I this is not to say Overlord's a bad deck. Overlord is a good deck. I just don't think that it's going to be the meta warping kind of thing that we thought that it might be. Like when we first saw it, it was like, oh my gosh, like look at this thing. You can't touch it. It has all these burns and it has this power. And sure, it has all those things, but it also is susceptible to certain lines of play. And I think that could be a challenge for it. And one of the things I think it's most susceptible to right now is things like Azure Lane, which just wants to throw damage at you the whole game. Like throwing 4-4-4 at you on turn 1 is absolutely terrifying. Do not love sitting across from that. But yeah, no, I've gotten shot to 1-5 by Azure Lane on turn 2. Like I draw on turn 2. I have 1 stock and I'm at 1-5. That does not feel good. I don't like that. But Overlord, I think in particular, can really die to that. Because it wants to go to 2 in its first deck. I think that's an issue. Anytime you have a deck whose game plan requires you to be less compressed because you need to get into 2 before refresh, that's a yellow flag. I don't think it's not necessarily a red flag, because I mean we've had decks in the past that, you know, have done that and done that well, and it's because they can find a way to decompress themselves. Looking at you, Kanata specifically, you know, because it can decompress itself by yanking cards out of the next deck and putting them into other zones, so the compression gets better. But Eins don't really do that like that.
The only thing it tries to do that is with the events. Like the events, exactly. That's the only way. Yeah.
Yeah, and that doesn't happen until it's already like got like if you can keep pushing it, right? Like if you can punish it for that and just keep pushing it further and further into 2, like Eins doesn't hold up to that very well, I don't think. Again, this is just in playtesting and, you know, all that. When it eats damage, it kind of dies, like just like everything else. But like it really dies because it needs that extra time to set up.
So, but really kind of with that in mind, there's a deck that also pushes and rushes that as well, being Azure Lane, right? Azure Lane then coming in and being that next kind of Soul Rush kind of deck where it's able to spit out that kind of damage numbers at 0.
Yep. And we don't really have Alexander's dataset didn't really have numbers for Azure Lane yet. It's still very new, so we don't really have numbers for Azure Lane in that context. But it's only been available for a few events. It's already got 4 tops, 2 top 4s. And it's mostly, I mean, it's a lot. There's a lot of that 2 soul running around, and a lot of that everything seems to be running the cats at 0. And that really seems to be the thing that's setting Azure Lane apart, is that early game soul rush. The rest of the package, the rest of the deck is definitely fine. It's even good. But man, the ability to just throw potentially 12 damage at your opponent on the first turn of the game, that's insane. Data Live, not toxic anymore. Thank God. But playable again, I guess. I don't know. Dal's fine. You can still play Data Live. It's still playable. If you're a true believer in Data Live, I think that you're vindicated a bit by these results. Like, look at Data Live being a top 10 set again in terms of representation and top 8. Nice job. Jokes aside, like, honestly, Data Live still hanging around after all this time and all these bans is a testament to how much the Data Live players continue to hone their craft, and also just how good that set really was when it came out. Oh my gosh, Bushiroad, please do not do that to us again. Attack on Titan had 3 tops, which this surprised me. I thought AOT was basically dead, but AOT, I think all these tops were on the choice top end. So AOT still getting some tops. AOT still finding its way into relevancy here down the stretch. Don Machi kind of feels a little bit bygone, if I'm being honest. It's, kind of like that classic 1K1 deck, but it doesn't have the same powerful profiles as some of these other decks. And if you look at the decks above it, there are very few classic 1K1s in the top 10 decks overall, right? Because you've got, I'm looking up here at Hololive, you've got the Ozkigura, it's like a standby into level 3. You got 8 standby. Kanta, which is not a traditional level 1, into Marine, which is a traditional level 3. But then you keep going down, it's like you have a level 1 into a level 2 in Slime. The Alice was not a traditional level 1. 8 Salvage Quince is probably the most powerful traditional level 1. 8 Choice up there as well. But even Avatar, it's running a standby. Escanor, it's either running a 0 or a 2. So all these other decks, the 1K1 meta really feels like it's kind of gone. It doesn't feel like a lot of stuff is really running the 1K1 traditional package anymore. And Danmachi feels kind of like a relic of that era. But it's also less powerful than other 1K1s that are available to players in 2023. So we'll see what happens with Danmachi. If we get Danmachi 2 and it gets a better top end, that's going to be a huge deal. That's really Danmachi's Achilles heel from where I sit, having sat across from it a lot. The issue is I'm not really scared of Danmachi killing me if I'm not at 3-0. So, that's kind of the issue for Danmachi based on my experience and what I've sat across from. But how about Adventure Time? I say how about Adventure Time like Brandon is here to talk about this. Brandon is clearly working on things.
I'm here. I'm still existing.
Oh, okay. How about Adventure Time, Brandon? How cool is that Adventure Time is still relevant in 2023?
I mean...
I love it. I think it's great. I love it when sets that aren't new are still performing well, and late in the season too. Adventure Time topped 2 weeks ago.
You didn't have to play against Alice.
Yeah, that helps. You don't have to try to tech around it anymore. You can just play. And I think that's one of the reasons why they really wanted to hit Alice was Alice was gatekeeping so many things, and you've seen that in the last few weeks. I don't love ban lists. We've been over this a million times. I think that the solution to banning things is don't print things in the first place, and if you do, then print things to counter them. But having looked at what has opened up in the meta since Alice got hit, I get it, man. I get it. I get it. I get it. I think I might warm up to this Alice ban as time moves on, just because it opens up other things that are much better now. Other things are so much better. Quince is better. Escanor is better. Danmachi is better. Adventure Time is better. All because Alice is gone. And I think that long term that might be good for the game. As coming from someone who's not very, who's very anti-ban list by and large, this hit might be good for the game. And that's maybe the only time you've ever heard me say that. It's Christmas time. I'm getting soft. But yeah, and then follow it up with Bang Dream a couple of tops, Kagi a couple of tops. Both sets still relevant. They've got some stuff they can do. Bang Dream, obviously diverse. Bang Dream's going to get cards forever, so like I don't think Bang Dream's ever going to be off this graphic entirely. It's in a downtime because it hasn't had a new set in a minute, but that will change in time, I'm sure. And then Kaguya. Kaguya did nothing wrong. Like I don't know why we're still sitting on a Kaguya ban at this point. Like let Kaguya be free, please.
I'm glad that Kaguya was able to get a couple of tops in to be able to, especially I think the timing on some of those tops were also interesting too, right? So like just being able to see some kind of just I like the spread. I like seeing the spread of decks being able to come up in the top and be able to see how many of them we can actually see in top 8 and the spread of the top 8 ones. So Kaguya being able to get a couple decks in, I think it's really nice too.
I definitely agree with that. If this is our reward for having Alice on the ban list, that ban might have been the right decision.